The morning sun cut a sharp line across the Coronado training base, painting the asphalt in harsh gold and silver. The wind whipped through the yard, tossing dust and bits of paper like it had a mind of its own. Recruits were already lined up for the early morning conditioning drills, stretching, jogging in place, and whispering to one another, trying to size up the strangers in the other units. Among them strode Private Luke Harrelson, his head high, chest puffed out, and a grin that dared the world to challenge him. He was 19, tall, lean, and cocky, with a swagger he thought compensated for a lack of real battlefield experience. His uniform was perfectly neat, his boots freshly polished, and his cap tilted at a jaunty angle, the whole package of "I've arrived and I'm the best." Around him, his small circle of army buddies mirrored his confidence, laughing and nudging one another with jokes about Navy SEALs and their fancy wrist tattoos and slick hairstyles. Luke had never met a Navy SEAL in real life. He didn't know what they trained for, what kind of missions they went on, or how brutal their reality could be. What he did know was what he had seen in movies. SEALs were supposed to be these untouchable warriors, glorified in stories and cinematic shots. And what Luke loved most was testing that mythology, seeing if these perfect soldiers were as untouchable as everyone said. His eyes caught movement near the pull-up bars on the far side of the PT yard. Petty Officer First Class Riley Knox. She was stretching, calm, composed, almost statuesque. She wore the standard SEAL training uniform, but there was a presence about her that made her stand apart. No chatter, no overconfidence, just a controlled grace. That irritably perfect calm that made Luke's blood hum with the need to prove something. "Watch this," Luke muttered to his friends, a smirk dancing on his lips. "I'll see if she's a good SEAL or just another overhyped paper badge." His friends leaned in, curious and slightly nervous. Some wanted to intervene, some were already grinning, expecting a show. Luke jogged toward her with a purpose, feet hitting the asphalt in quick, decisive thuds. His heart raced, part from adrenaline, part from the thrill of asserting dominance. From behind, he gave a quick tap kick to the back of her leg, light, casual, meant to provoke rather than injure. A flicker of expectation flashed across his mind. She would stumble, flinch, turn around in shock, maybe even snap at him. That was the normal reaction for anyone confronted by someone like Luke Harrelson. But she didn't. Nothing happened, not a twitch, not a stumble, not even a glance in his direction. Luke froze mid-step, confusion flickering across his face. His kick had landed, at least, it had grazed her leg. Yet Riley Knox remained perfectly still, stretching calmly as though the kick had been nothing more than a breeze. The yard seemed to quiet around him. A bird froze mid-flight overhead. A distant truck engine droned, then vanished. Luke's buddies went silent, their laughter dying in their throats. The instructors, standing nearby in their crisp uniforms, suddenly took notice, their eyes narrowing, scanning Riley with something closer to interest than curiosity. Luke swallowed hard, the smirk on his face faltered. She began to rise slowly, each movement deliberate. Her hair was tied back tight, revealing the sharp line of her jaw and a neck trained from hours of conditioning. She didn't rush. She didn't hurry. She simply began to step forward, her eyes fixing on him now, and the calm intensity in her gaze sent a shockwave through Luke's chest. "Private," she said, her voice steady, almost eerily quiet, "do you have a question for me?" Luke's throat went dry. He stammered, his ego suddenly colliding with the realization that this was no ordinary SEAL recruit. I just checking if you're a good SEAL," he managed to mutter, the words tasting awkward and small in his mouth. Her eyes shifted downward briefly, scanning his stance, the trembling of his knees, the hesitation in his posture. Then she looked back up, unwavering. "Is that so?" she replied evenly, tilting her head slightly. "A test, you mean?" Luke nodded nervously, his pride bristling despite the fear prickling at the base of his spine. "Yes," he said, louder this time, trying to reclaim his bravado. "A test to see if you're good, really good." Riley's gaze lingered for a heartbeat longer than it should have, then flicked to the surrounding recruits. Some watched with wide eyes, some shifted uncomfortably, and some, the newer trainees, instinctively backed away a little. Without another word, Riley stepped to the center of the mat, a wide, cleared area in the middle of the PT yard. She removed her jacket slowly, revealing toned shoulders and forearms that bore the quiet marks of countless drills and missions. That was when a gasp rippled through the nearby recruits. Across her right shoulder blade was a black ink insignia, a trident entwined with a dagger. The symbol was instantly recognizable to anyone in the know, a mark of an operator who had endured missions few civilians, or even fellow military personnel, could imagine. Luke's jaw dropped. He had only seen the emblem in photographs online, never up close, never in person, and certainly not on someone who didn't seem to care about proving herself to anyone. Her calmness, her presence, and now that insignia, it all collided into a stark, undeniable truth. He was standing in front of someone who had seen the world in ways he couldn't comprehend. Someone whose training and experience dwarfed anything he had achieved in 2 months at the base. Luke's bravado wavered. He could feel it unraveling. His friends leaned closer, whispering to one another, their faces pale. Then Riley, still calm, still unreadable, nodded toward him. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Luke swallowed hard. His chest tightened. He was a man fueled by ego, but suddenly ego was a heavy, sinking weight. He stepped onto the mat, trying to steady himself. Every muscle in his body screamed caution, every instinct shouted to run, but pride, that stupid, dangerous pride, held him in place. He raised his fists, shook out his arms, and attempted a stance he had learned in basic. His hands wobbled slightly, his knees weren't aligned, and his feet felt like lead. Riley didn't move. She simply watched, unmoving, her eyes calm and piercing. Luke lunged. She didn't dodge. She didn't counter immediately. And that hesitation, that fraction of a second where he thought he might succeed, ended with her shifting, almost imperceptibly, guiding him forward and redirecting his momentum. He stumbled, arms flailing, and hit the mat with a thud that seemed to echo across the yard. But she didn't release him. She leaned close, eyes locked on his, and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. "You want to know what makes a good SEAL?" Luke froze, his ears rang, his breath hitched. He nodded slightly. "Surviving what I survived," she continued, her voice low, steady, and unyielding. Before he could process it, she released him, stepping back, her gaze still holding his like a promise and a warning wrapped together. Luke's friends were speechless. The instructors exchanged silent nods, understanding exactly what they had just witnessed. The yard seemed to exhale as tension hung in the air. Luke, chest heaving, stared at Riley Knox. The smirk that had been there disappeared entirely. For the first time, he realized he had crossed a line far beyond a petty joke. And as Riley turned, collected herself, and walked back to her station with effortless grace, the recruits and Luke were left staring at a living, breathing reminder that myth sometimes walks among us in human form. And somewhere deep in Luke's chest, a seed of fear, respect, and curiosity had taken root. Because that kick was about to be the least consequential thing he had done that day, Luke Harrelson's knees were still wobbling from the impact of the mat when Riley Knox finally straightened. The yard had quieted to a near-hallowed hush. Other recruits stared, slack-jawed, at the quiet, commanding figure of the Navy SEAL who had just, with the subtlest of movements, reduced a cocky private to a human heap. The instructors exchanged knowing glances, their faces revealing only the faintest acknowledgement. This was exactly the kind of test they didn't want to conduct, but were too wise to interrupt. Luke's chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind spinning. Pride, which had once inflated him like a balloon, now felt like a lead weight. He tried to speak, to muster some form of insult, some sarcastic jab that could redeem him in front of his peers. But the words caught in his throat. His ego faltered, replaced by an instinctive sense of danger he couldn't name. Riley's eyes locked onto his. Calm, unflinching, almost unnervingly sharp. They didn't just look at him, they seemed to measure, calculate, scan for weakness. Luke's bravado evaporated under the intensity of that gaze. He realized in a flash that whatever reputation he thought he had, it didn't matter here. In front of her, he was nothing more than a trainee, a mistake waiting to happen. "You've got a question, Private," she said, her voice low, measured, almost conversational, yet carrying an authority that silenced the nearby chatter. Luke's mouth opened, then closed. He swallowed hard, trying to reassert himself. I just wanted to see if you're a good SEAL," he finally stammered, each word tasting foreign on his tongue. Her gaze didn't soften. It didn't falter. Instead, it pinned him in place, an invisible tether he could not break. Riley tilted her head slightly, a faint, unreadable expression playing across her features. "Is that so?" she said quietly, her voice steady but carrying a subtle edge like ice under steel. "A test, you mean?" Luke nodded, his pride bristling even as the knot in his stomach tightened. "Yeah, a test," he said, louder this time, trying to sound confident, "to see if you're actually any good." Riley Knox didn't answer immediately. She simply stepped onto the mat at the center of the PT yard, her movements precise and unhurried. Dust kicked up around her boots as she walked, yet she seemed untouched by it, a calm eye in the whirlwind of Luke's ego and the recruit's astonishment. Then she did something that stopped Luke cold. She removed her jacket. It was a small motion, almost casual, but what it revealed was anything but ordinary. Her uniform underneath was tight, practical, showing lean muscles honed through years of grueling training. But it wasn't just her physicality that made the yard go silent. It was the insignia on her right shoulder blade. A black trident entwined with a dagger, the mark of a SEAL team operator who had survived missions most people couldn't even imagine. Luke's mind scrambled. He had seen pictures online of this emblem, heard whispers about what it meant, but he never imagined he would see it in person. And certainly never on someone who had just stood silently, motionless, as he tried to kick her. A ripple of whispers spread through the recruits. "Is that real? She's Team 6, isn't she? No, she's too young." Luke didn't hear them. His brain had frozen like his body, unable to process the truth. The woman standing before him was not just skilled. She was elite, beyond elite, and she had survived. That emblem wasn't a decoration, it was a declaration. Then she nodded toward him, ever so slightly, and said the words that made Luke's stomach clench. "Whenever you're ready." Luke's pride made him step forward. His ego whispered that he could still assert himself, that this was his chance to prove he wasn't just a novice. He squared his shoulders, clenched his fists, and assumed a stance he had been taught in the basic training manual. It looked good on paper. In reality, he was trembling. Riley didn't move. She simply stood there, her eyes locked onto his, calm and unyielding. The weight of her gaze pressed down on him, and he realized that she wasn't just watching. She was analyzing, measuring, anticipating. Every muscle in her body was ready, every movement calculated, every intention hidden beneath a veneer of silence. Luke lunged. The moment he moved, Riley's entire demeanor changed, not in aggression but in precision. She shifted her weight just enough to redirect his momentum, guiding him forward and down, her movements so fluid it seemed almost preternatural. Luke hit the mat with a thud, the sound reverberating through the yard. Dust puffed up around him, and for a heartbeat, the world felt like it had narrowed to the spot where he had fallen. But she didn't release him. Her eyes bore into his as she leaned close, whispering just loud enough for him to hear. "You want to know what makes a good SEAL?" Luke's mind scrambled. He wanted to pull away, to respond, to fight back, but his body was frozen. Pride had brought him here, and now fear rooted him in place. "Surviving what I survived," she continued, her voice low and steady. The words weren't a boast. They weren't a threat. They were a quiet declaration of reality, one Luke couldn't begin to understand. He felt the weight of those words settle over him, heavy and suffocating. Every muscle in his body tensed. His ego, which had carried him into this moment, now felt like a liability. He had challenged someone who had lived through experiences he couldn't even imagine, and he was still standing, but barely. Riley released him, stepping back with effortless grace, as though the whole encounter had been nothing more than a casual exercise. The recruits around the yard stared, silent, wide-eyed, as they processed what they had just witnessed. The instructors nodded subtly to each other, recognizing the significance of the encounter. Luke scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving, his face flushed with humiliation and awe. His friends hovered nearby, unsure whether to congratulate him for surviving or scold him for acting like a fool. Riley turned, collected herself, and walked back to her station, her movements smooth, controlled, and completely composed. Each step seemed to resonate with an invisible authority. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. She was a Navy SEAL. She was elite. And she was untouchable. Luke, meanwhile, felt a mixture of fear, respect, and a gnawing curiosity that he had never experienced before. He had thought he was testing her. Instead, he had been tested, and he had failed spectacularly. As Riley disappeared into the formation of SEAL trainees, Luke's eyes lingered on her shoulder insignia. That trident and dagger weren't just a symbol. They were a warning, a promise, a story he would never understand unless he earned the right to. He realized with a sinking certainty that the kick he had thought was insignificant had just set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he believed about courage, skill, and survival. And deep down, buried beneath the embarrassment and the fear, something else stirred, a spark of intrigue, a silent acknowledgement that he had just encountered someone whose life was a battlefield he could never enter, a life story far more intense than any he had ever known. Luke took a deep breath, steadied himself, and for the first time truly looked at Riley Knox. She wasn't just a Navy SEAL. She was a force of nature, and he had just discovered, to his regret and awe, that some battles weren't about strength or bravado. They were about endurance, training, and surviving what most people wouldn't even survive in their nightmares. And the day was only beginning. The hum of the PT yard had returned, but only faintly. Conversations had stalled, shuffling feet paused mid-step, and even the distant hum of engines and birds seemed muted, as if the entire base were holding its breath. All eyes were on Riley Knox, who had just revealed more than anyone in the yard could have anticipated. Luke Harrelson's ego had been bruised, but now fear mingled with curiosity. He had tested her. He had failed. And the symbol inked across her shoulder, it wasn't just a decoration. It was a declaration of a life that had survived horrors few even dared to imagine. The black ink emblem glinted faintly under the rising sun, a trident entwined with a dagger. To the uninitiated, it might have seemed like a generic military tattoo. To anyone who knew, it was the mark of a SEAL team operator who had survived classified missions, joint operations, and the kind of combat most people never even read about in news reports. Luke's mouth went dry. He had seen pictures online, sure, but photographs didn't prepare a man for the realization that someone standing silently in front of him had lived and died in battles he could not begin to imagine. His pulse hammered. The adrenaline from the earlier encounter still coursed through him, but now it was tinged with a raw, sharp edge of awe and fear. Whispers rippled through the recruits. Is that real?" one murmured. "She's Team 6, another asked, eyes wide. "No way," a third breathed. "She's way too young, she can't." But Riley ignored them. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the murmurs. She simply squared her shoulders, tied her hair tighter, and motioned for Luke to step forward. Luke's chest tightened. His pride screamed at him to refuse, to walk away, to claim some shred of dignity. But curiosity and ego intertwined into a dangerous cocktail. He took another step forward. "Come here," Riley said, calm but commanding. Show me your best takedown." Luke froze. His friends gasped, eyebrows raised. Instructors leaned forward, watching the interaction with keen interest. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The tension in the air was palpable, the kind that comes when something extraordinary is about to unfold, something that defies the ordinary order of things. Luke's mind raced. Takedown? What, me against her? He had seen training videos, he had done drills, he had sparred with other recruits. But Riley Knox was Riley Knox. She had survived operations that left seasoned soldiers broken and traumatized. Her calm, measured movements weren't just about strength. They were honed by fire, fear, and survival. He stepped onto the mat. His hands shook slightly. His knees were tight, his stance imperfect. His entire body screamed that he was in over his head. Riley didn't move. She didn't attack. She merely stood, observing, letting him initiate. Luke lunged, a clumsy, desperate attempt at a takedown. Riley shifted, not with aggression but with precision. She guided his momentum, redirected his weight, and in one smooth motion he was back on the mat, sprawled flat, dust rising around him. The yard gasped collectively. And then she leaned in. Her voice was quiet, intimate, just loud enough for him to hear. "You want to know what makes a good SEAL?" Luke's throat went dry, his pride faltered. "Surviving what you survived," he whispered. "Exactly," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Endurance, skill, and the ability to stay calm when the world is falling apart around you." He nodded, chest heaving, sweat glistening across his forehead. He realized something vital. Riley wasn't trying to humiliate him. Not anymore. She was demonstrating control, precision, mastery, qualities Luke didn't yet understand but instinctively respected. Then she stepped back. Just a few feet. Not enough to give him confidence, but enough that the entire yard could see her posture, her muscles, her calm dominance. That's when the whispers began again, louder this time, and the instructors exchanged looks that only seasoned veterans could read. Recognition. "Team 6, one muttered. "She's a combat veteran," said another, barely audible. Luke's stomach dropped. "A combat veteran here at our base, and I just tested her." But the most astonishing part wasn't just her presence. It was what her body language said, every subtle movement, every calculated breath. The trident on her shoulder was a declaration, yes, but her demeanor confirmed it. She had seen combat, she had faced death, and she had come back alive, stronger, sharper, and untouchable. Luke's ego had been bruised, his pride shattered, but curiosity burned brighter than ever. He wanted to know everything. How had she survived? What missions had she been on? What horrors had she faced that gave her the calm, lethal control she exhibited even now? Before he could dwell on it, Riley stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate, and mesmerizing. The silence of the yard deepened. "Your form is weak," she said, her voice low, cutting through the murmur of recruits. "Your stance, your footwork, you rely too much on brute force. SEALs don't survive on strength alone. We survive on technique, anticipation, and endurance." Luke swallowed, ashamed. He had always relied on ego and speed. Now, standing in front of a living legend, he realized how foolish that approach had been. Riley's eyes flicked toward the instructors, then back at him. "Do you want to learn?" Luke hesitated. The fear, the awe, the humiliation, all of it clashed inside him. Finally, he nodded. "Good," she said, "then pay attention." She stepped to his side, correcting his stance with subtle nudges. She guided his movements, showing him the difference between strength and leverage, between momentum and control. Each adjustment was quiet, deliberate, and painfully effective. The recruits watching slowly realized something astonishing. Riley wasn't just displaying her skill. She was teaching, transforming Luke's crude attempts into something approaching competence. Every motion, every subtle correction, spoke of years of experience, of battles fought, of lives saved and lost. Luke tried to keep up, sweat pouring, muscles straining, pride still bruised but now mingled with determination. Each corrected movement felt like a small victory, but the underlying truth remained undeniable. She was untouchable. And then Riley did something that made the entire base gasp once more. With a fluid motion, she executed a sweeping takedown, clean, controlled, and painless. Luke hit the mat again, hard dust rising around him. But this time it wasn't humiliation that washed over him. It was understanding. He had been humbled, and in that humility a spark of respect ignited. Riley extended a hand to help him up. Luke hesitated, then took it. His fingers brushed against hers. He could feel the strength beneath the calm exterior. Her grip wasn't crushing, but it was firm, a statement of her confidence and control. As he rose to his feet, the yard remained silent. The instructors nodded, recruits whispered, and Luke's friends stared in awe. Luke realized something profound. He hadn't just encountered a Navy SEAL. He had encountered a force of nature, someone whose life experience, skill, and discipline made every movie stereotype, every story he had ever believed, pale in comparison. And somewhere deep inside him, fear and curiosity battled with ego. Because this was Riley Knox. And Luke Harrelson had just discovered that some battles weren't about strength. They were about survival, endurance, and mastery, qualities he could only begin to grasp. The yard exhaled collectively. But Luke knew one thing for certain. The moment he had kicked her was insignificant compared to the lessons he had just begun to learn. The PT yard had never been this silent. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, as if aware that something extraordinary was unfolding. Every recruit, every instructor, every observer's gaze was locked on Riley Knox, the Navy SEAL who had just humbled Luke Harrelson and left the entire yard questioning reality. Then a voice cut through the silence like a cannon shot. Knox Harrelson front and center. The sound of Commander Jonas Mercer's boots hitting the asphalt reverberated across the base. His figure approached, tall, broad, and impossibly commanding, with a presence forged in decades of military service. Gray-streaked hair framed a stern, weathered face, and his eyes, sharp and unwavering, scanned the yard with precision. He didn't just command attention, he demanded it. Riley instinctively snapped to attention. Luke froze, scrambling to his feet, his chest heaving, adrenaline still pulsing through his veins. He was used to the occasional drill sergeant yelling, the occasional reprimand, but Commander Mercer was a different force entirely. His presence alone could reduce even the boldest recruit to self-conscious stiffness. Luke's friends shuffled uneasily. Some whispered, "Who is that guy?" Others simply stared, mouths slightly open, realizing instinctively that this was someone whose reputation preceded him. Commander Mercer's eyes weren't on Luke. They were on Riley, and not with anger. Not exactly. There was recognition there, concern, a subtle weight of respect and history. "Petty Officer Knox," Mercer's voice was low but resonant, carrying authority that silenced even the murmurs. "You weren't supposed to demonstrate that." Riley remained silent, her jaw tightening slightly, a muscle flexing involuntarily. Her calm exterior didn't waver, but her posture subtly stiffened. She didn't look guilty. She looked measured, as though weighing whether to defy him. Luke's heart pounded. Something in Mercer's tone hinted at secrets, past missions, events Luke couldn't begin to understand. Why did the commander sound like he already knew her history deeply, intimately? Mercer let out a long, measured breath. "For those of you who don't know, and it's apparent some of you don't, Petty Officer Knox has returned from a classified recovery mission overseas. She is on restricted duty. She has earned more than your respect. She has earned silence." The yard went still again. Whispers surged, even from the recruits standing at the edges. "Classified recovery mission," someone muttered. "Restricted duty," another asked. The questions hung in the air, unspoken, unanswered, leaving a tense, heavy atmosphere. Luke felt his throat tighten. Recovery mission, restricted duty. Suddenly, the moment he had spent trying to assert dominance seemed childish, almost foolish. He had kicked someone who had survived horrors he could not begin to imagine, and Mercer's words confirmed it. Mercer's gaze softened just slightly, but it was enough to convey decades of shared history with Riley Knox. He approached her, and for the first time, Riley didn't respond immediately. The calm, unshakable exterior faltered for a brief second, almost imperceptibly, and Luke caught it. "She's cleared to spar?" Mercer asked, his tone low, almost conversational but with unmistakable authority. "Yes, sir," Riley replied, crisp, steady, though her eyes betrayed the faintest flicker of tension. "Good," Mercer said, his voice carrying across the silent yard. "Then finish it, but keep it controlled." Luke's chest tightened. Controlled. Finish it. The words carried an invisible weight, as if acknowledging the potential for danger. Luke realized that what had begun as a simple test of ego had escalated far beyond his understanding. He was stepping into a realm where real experience and skill outweighed bravado, where one misstep could have consequences he couldn't predict. Riley stepped back onto the mat. Her movements were deliberate, measured. Each shift of weight, each adjustment of her stance, radiated experience and authority. Luke's stomach churned. He tried to steady himself, tried to summon some semblance of confidence, but it was fleeting. Mercer's eyes scanned the yard, noting every reaction. The widened eyes of the recruits, the tense postures of the instructors, the flush of adrenaline on Luke's face. He nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly to himself. Riley had always been exceptional, always precise, always capable. And now, in front of the entire yard, her history, her legacy, was quietly, unmistakably revealed. Luke lunged again, a clumsy attempt to demonstrate his own skill. Riley's response was subtle but devastatingly effective. She sidestepped, redirected his momentum, and in one fluid motion, Luke hit the mat again. Dust rose around him, his ears ringing with the impact. Riley didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The demonstration alone was sufficient, a quiet assertion of skill that spoke louder than any words. Luke felt his body tense. Pride warred with respect, humiliation warred with curiosity. He had no idea what to do next. Mercer approached, his gaze steady, his presence commanding. "Riley, you remember the extraction protocols," he said quietly, almost a reminder to herself rather than an order. Riley nodded minutely, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between them. It was subtle, invisible to most of the yard, but Luke caught it. There was history here. Deep, complicated, and filled with experiences that he couldn't hope to understand. The tension in the yard thickened as Riley refocused on him. "Step forward," she instructed quietly. Luke hesitated, then complied, his movements stiff, uncertain. Every nerve screamed caution. Every instinct screamed retreat. But he had no choice. Ego demanded he follow through, if only to salvage a shred of dignity. Riley moved to his side, correcting his posture, adjusting his guard. Her touch was firm but not harsh, a careful guidance born of years of teaching, training, and surviving. Luke felt the weight of experience in every subtle correction. Her presence was a living demonstration of discipline, precision, and endurance. And then, just as Luke began to feel a fragile sense of understanding, the commander's voice rang out across the yard again. "Knox Harrelson, eyes forward." Luke froze. Riley's eyes flicked toward Mercer, her calm unwavering despite the subtle tension that rippled through her body. Mercer's stern gaze was more than authority. It was recognition, respect, and concern intertwined. Luke realized that Riley wasn't just a Navy SEAL. She was someone whose past missions had shaped not only her skills, but also the respect and caution of the highest-ranking officers on the base. And Luke, by some foolish impulse, had just tested her. The yard's collective breath seemed to hold. Every recruit, every instructor, every observer understood without words that what they were witnessing was extraordinary. This wasn't just skill or experience. This was history, trauma, endurance, and survival distilled into a single person. Riley Knox's calm exterior never faltered, but Luke could sense it now. The slightest tension in her jaw, the minute tightening of her shoulders, the subtle focus in her eyes. She had survived battles that would break most men. And yet here she stood, commanding attention, controlling the situation with a quiet, lethal precision. Luke's mind raced. The insignia on her shoulder was no longer just a tattoo. It was a story, a declaration, a warning. He had crossed a line, stepped into a world he didn't understand, and survived only because Riley allowed it. And as Riley prepared to demonstrate once more, guiding Luke through corrections and subtle maneuvers, he realized a fundamental truth. Everything he thought he knew about strength, skill, and courage was meaningless in the presence of someone who had truly seen combat and survived. The commander stepped back, his eyes never leaving Riley. The lesson wasn't just for Luke. It was for every recruit, every observer, every trainee who had thought they understood what it meant to be strong. Because here, in the center of the PT yard on a crisp morning in Coronado, the truth was clear. Some battles are fought beyond the mat, beyond ego, beyond the imagination. And some warriors carry the proof on their very skin. Luke swallowed hard, his breath catching. Pride and fear tangled inside him, forming a knot he couldn't undo. He had been humbled, yes, but he had also glimpsed something extraordinary, a level of mastery and endurance that demanded not just respect, but awe. And as Riley guided him into the next movement, Luke realized with a sinking certainty that the real lessons were only just beginning. The PT yard had returned to its usual rhythm, but a palpable tension lingered in the air, like static before a storm. Luke Harrelson's muscles ached, sweat clung to his uniform, and every nerve in his body still screamed with adrenaline. He had survived his first encounter with Riley Knox, barely. But now, under the piercing gaze of both Riley and Commander Mercer, he understood that this was only the beginning. Riley stepped toward him, her boots silent against the asphalt. Her movements were fluid, precise, and unnervingly calm. Dust swirled around her legs like a halo, a visual reminder that this was not just training. This was mastery. "Hands up," she instructed. Her voice was firm, commanding, yet oddly patient. Luke raised his fists, his stance trembling. Pride had been stripped from him, replaced by raw awareness that he was dangerously unprepared. "Again," Riley said, circling him slowly. "But this time listen, feel, don't think." Luke blinked. Feel, don't think. His mind screamed with rational tactics, drills, angles, momentum, everything he had been taught. But Riley was teaching something beyond the manuals, beyond the textbooks. She was teaching intuition, reaction, survival instinct. "Close your eyes," she added quietly. Luke froze, closed his eyes. Against a Navy SEAL, he wanted to argue, to refuse, to assert himself. But something in her gaze, that silent command, made him hesitate. Finally, shaking slightly, he obeyed. The world went black. Sounds sharpened. Dust in the air, the distant hum of a truck, even the slight creak of a boot, all magnified. Luke felt every vibration in the ground, every subtle shift in the air, as though the world had slowed down. "Step forward," Riley whispered. Luke obeyed, slow and cautious. Suddenly, a hand tapped his shoulder, light, precise, almost imperceptible. He barely registered it before she whispered again. "Balance, weight, momentum." He staggered slightly, correcting himself. The lesson wasn't in force. It was in control. Luke felt his muscles tense and release, trying to internalize movements that had once been reflexive, now reshaped into disciplined precision. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. Riley guided him through takedowns, reversals, and defensive techniques. Each correction was gentle but unyielding. She would adjust his arm here, shift his stance there, and in every movement, Luke felt the weight of experience behind it. The recruits around the yard watched in awe. Some whispered, some leaned forward, some simply held their breath. Every subtle movement Riley made was a masterclass, a demonstration of skill honed in the crucible of real combat. And then, just as Luke began to feel a fragile sense of progress, Riley paused. She stepped back and surveyed him critically. "Do you understand why you keep failing?" she asked. Luke swallowed. "Because I'm not strong enough." Riley shook her head slowly, almost sadly. "No, you fail because you fight how you think the world should fight, not how the world actually is. You're fighting for pride, for ego. You're fighting to prove something to yourself or others. A SEAL fights to survive, to complete the mission, and only then does pride matter." Luke's chest tightened. Her words cut deeper than any physical strike could. They weren't just instructions, they were truth, and it hurt to hear it, to feel it, to confront it. "Survival," she continued, her voice lowering, almost intimate. "It's not just strength or speed. It's awareness. It's control. It's reading your opponent, reading your environment, and most importantly, reading yourself. You can't fight what you don't understand." Luke nodded, though he wasn't sure he fully grasped it. His ego still whispered, "I can be better. I can prove myself." But Riley's gaze, calm and unwavering, told him that proving himself wouldn't come from force. It would come from something far deeper. Then, without warning, she struck. Not hard, not viciously, but with perfect timing, precision, and placement, she tapped him again to the mat. Dust rose in the air, and the yard collectively gasped. Luke struggled to catch his breath, his chest heaving, sweat stinging his eyes. But this time, humiliation mingled with something else: clarity. He was learning. Slowly, painfully, imperceptibly, he was learning. Riley knelt beside him, her voice quiet, almost conspiratorial. "I've lost teammates, Harrelson. I've been in situations where a single misstep costs lives. Every movement, every breath, every decision matters. This is why you fail when you fight for pride. This is why SEALs survive when others don't." Luke's breath caught. For the first time, he saw the shadow behind her calm exterior, the weight of missions, of losses, of experience. Her teachings were not just techniques, they were warnings, lessons carved from reality and survival. "Do you understand?" she asked. Luke nodded slowly, unable to speak. Words felt meaningless here. The lesson wasn't in speaking. It was in feeling, in internalizing, in surviving. Riley stood, brushing dust from her uniform, and gestured toward the mat. "Again," she said. "From the top. Focus, control, anticipation. Forget pride, forget ego, remember survival." Luke took a deep breath, grounding himself. His fists rose, his knees bent, his stance adjusting as instinct slowly replaced hesitation. This time, when he lunged, he moved differently, controlled, aware, responsive. Riley's subtle guidance corrected him, nudged him, but didn't overpower him. And for the first time, he felt a small spark of progress. Not confidence, not pride, but understanding. The yard watched, breathless. Recruits whispered among themselves, recognizing that what they were witnessing wasn't just a training session. It was a transformation. Hours blurred. Sweat-soaked uniforms, muscles burned, minds raced. Luke's body screamed for rest, but he continued. Riley's corrections were relentless, patient, precise, a master teaching a novice, not with cruelty but with uncompromising truth. At one point, Luke stumbled, a misstep he thought would end the exercise. But Riley caught his arm, steadying him with ease, her eyes locking onto his. "Don't fight the lesson," she said quietly. "Let it guide you. Survival isn't about winning here. It's about learning fast. Life doesn't wait for hesitation." Luke swallowed, nodding, understanding in his gut what she meant. This was more than combat training. This was a glimpse into a world most people would never see, a world where mistakes were deadly, where skill was survival, and where every movement carried consequences far beyond pride. As the sun climbed higher, the yard seemed to fade around him. Luke's focus narrowed to Riley's movements, her voice, the subtle shifts in her stance. He wasn't thinking. He was feeling, reacting, learning. And somewhere deep in his chest, the seed of respect and awe blossomed. He still had much to learn, much to endure, much to survive. But for the first time, Luke Harrelson realized that the lessons Riley Knox was teaching him were not about beating her. They were about becoming someone who could survive in a world he had barely begun to understand. And the full weight of that realization settled over him like a storm. The PT yard, still buzzing faintly from earlier events, now felt charged with an undercurrent of tension that even the strongest recruits could sense. Luke Harrelson's muscles throbbed with fatigue and sweat stung his eyes, but he barely noticed. His mind was spinning, replaying Riley Knox's movements, her instructions, her calm, commanding presence, and now an invisible barrier had been lifted. There was a story here, a history. Something unspoken but impossible to ignore. Commander Mercer stepped forward, his boots striking the asphalt in deliberate, echoing thuds. His eyes scanned the yard, but they returned repeatedly to Riley. Luke had seen the subtle acknowledgement in Part 4, the unspoken connection, the recognition of past missions that few, if any, could comprehend. Now Mercer spoke, his voice low but carrying an edge that drew immediate attention. "Knox," he said, "enough demonstration. Time for context. Everyone needs to understand why your presence here matters, and why, for some, that understanding will be difficult." Luke froze, his breath catching. Context, he thought, this isn't just about training. Riley remained calm, but her jaw tightened imperceptibly. She glanced at Mercer, then back at the gathered recruits. The words were coming, and Luke felt the air itself thicken. Mercer's gaze swept over Luke, then returned to Riley. Petty Officer Knox was part of a classified mission overseas, a mission that required not just physical skill, but extraordinary psychological resilience. The details are restricted, but the stakes were life and death, and she completed it, alone, under conditions that would break most of us in hours. A ripple of whispers swept through the recruits. "Classified mission?" one asked. "Alone?" another murmured. Eyes widened, jaws slackened. Even instructors leaned in subtly, understanding the significance of the statement without needing specifics. Luke's heart raced. He had only tested her, only challenged her ego, and now he was hearing hints of experiences that dwarfed his imagination. Mercer's tone softened slightly, but his words carried weight. There were casualties, yes, but Knox's skill, discipline, and composure ensured the mission's success. "That tattoo you see on her shoulder," he gestured subtly to the black trident entwined with a dagger. "It's not just symbolic. It represents survival, the endurance of someone who has faced unimaginable situations and emerged alive and competent." Luke's stomach tightened. The casual, flippant kick he had attempted earlier now seemed like a reckless, naive act of hubris. His pride, already bruised, shrank further under the weight of reality. Riley stepped forward, her voice steady but tinged with emotion barely visible under her calm exterior. "The mission Mercer refers to was one I volunteered for," she said quietly, yet every recruit could hear. "It required infiltration into hostile territory, extraction under fire, and decisions that no one should ever have to make. We lost team members. We lost friends. Some choices haunted me for years. That's the reality of survival, and that's the reality I carry with me every day." The yard fell silent. Dust motes floated lazily in the golden sunlight, each tiny particle a visual echo of the tension in the air. Luke's chest tightened. He had thought he understood resilience, had thought he understood bravery. He hadn't. Riley's gaze swept over him, piercing, calm, unflinching. "You want to know what makes a good SEAL, Harrelson? It's not about fighting with fists. It's about fighting with your mind, anticipating danger, protecting your team, making choices when the world is collapsing around you. Survival isn't flashy. It's quiet, disciplined, and relentless." Luke nodded slowly, the weight of comprehension beginning to settle in. The adrenaline of earlier bravado had faded, replaced by a mix of awe and fear. His training, his pride, even his bravest attempts now seemed almost trivial compared to the experiences Riley had lived through. Mercer added quietly, almost reverently, "And that's why, despite the risk, I brought her here. She teaches what books and drills cannot. She embodies the lessons every recruit needs to learn, lessons that extend far beyond the physical. Luke felt a strange mix of emotions: intimidation, respect, curiosity, and even guilt. His ego, which had driven him to kick Riley in the first place, now seemed fragile and misplaced. He had underestimated her in ways that could have been disastrous. Riley moved closer, demonstrating a series of precise maneuvers, adjustments to stance, leverage, and balance. Luke mimicked her, focusing intently, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. The lessons weren't just physical, they were mental, emotional, strategic. Every shift, every subtle correction carried the weight of missions fought, lives saved, and decisions made in moments of extreme pressure. As Luke executed a takedown under her careful guidance, he felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't about ego. This wasn't about proving himself. This was about learning, internalizing, surviving on and off the mat. Mercer watched silently, arms crossed, nodding subtly. "She's not here to break you," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She's here to show you what real survival looks like. If you can internalize even a fraction of her experience, you might make it out there, wherever out there might be." Luke's mind raced. Out there. He wasn't even sure he was ready for here. The gravity of the words pressed down on him. He realized that Riley's presence was not just a lesson in skill. It was a glimpse into a world where failure carried stakes far beyond bruised egos or physical pain. Riley's voice cut through his thoughts. "Harrelson, focus. Your stance. Anticipate. Don't overreach. Feel the rhythm, the momentum. Survival isn't about being the fastest or strongest. It's about being ready for the moment before it hits." Luke nodded, his movements becoming more fluid, more deliberate. The fear that had gripped him earlier didn't disappear, it evolved into cautious determination. He understood now that the lesson was bigger than the mat, bigger than physical prowess. It was about resilience, awareness, and control under pressure. The other recruits watched in awe as Riley guided Luke through sequences that tested his balance, reflexes, and strategy. Dust swirled with each movement, sunlight catching sweat on foreheads, muscles flexing with tension. This was no ordinary training session. This was an education in survival, discipline, and the harsh realities of combat. And then Riley paused. She stepped back, letting Luke adjust himself, sweat dripping from his brow, chest heaving. "Good," she said quietly, yet every word carried weight. "You're starting to understand. But remember, understanding is only the beginning. Survival is constant. It doesn't stop when the training ends, and it doesn't forgive mistakes." Luke's mind absorbed the words like a sponge, realizing that every correction, every nuance, every controlled movement was a lesson in more than combat. It was a lesson in life, in focus, in endurance. Mercer's gaze softened as he approached, his voice calm but firm. "You're seeing a glimpse, Harrelson, of what it means to operate in environments most people never imagine. Keep your eyes open. Pay attention. And remember this moment, because survival often depends on the lessons you refuse to ignore." Luke nodded silently, chest tight, sweat soaking his uniform. The full weight of Riley Knox's presence, her experience, and her secret missions pressed down on him. He had entered this yard thinking he was testing a recruit. Now, he understood he was a student in a classroom forged by combat, discipline, and survival. And somewhere in the quiet intensity of the moment, Luke realized that the story of Riley Knox, her missions, her survival, her strength, was far from over. He had glimpsed only the surface, a hint of the challenges, dangers, and resilience that defined her life. The PT yard, though returning to routine, held a new silence, one filled with awareness, respect, and unspoken acknowledgement of the extraordinary lessons that had just unfolded. Luke Harrelson's journey had begun, and the stakes, though he couldn't yet grasp them fully, were only about to rise. The sun had climbed high, its harsh light reflecting off the asphalt of the PT yard, casting long shadows across the recruits and instructors. Luke Harrelson's muscles burned with fatigue, sweat soaking through his uniform, his lungs gasping for air. But exhaustion was irrelevant. Fear, respect, and curiosity churned inside him, a storm that refused to settle. Commander Mercer stood at the perimeter, arms crossed, watching silently. His presence was a steadying force, but it also carried the unmistakable weight of judgment. He wasn't just an observer. He was a witness to what would unfold next, the culmination of lessons, the ultimate trial, and a reckoning that Luke could feel deep in his bones. Riley Knox stepped to the center of the yard, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each precise step. The black trident tattoo on her shoulder gleamed faintly in the sunlight, a symbol of survival, skill, and past battles that few could even imagine. Today, that symbol wasn't just an insignia. It was a warning. "Harrelson," she said, her voice low, calm, but carrying an edge that made his pulse spike. "This isn't about pride. It isn't about ego. It's about survival, awareness, and the ability to act when everything is against you. Today you will face your ultimate test." Luke's chest tightened. He had survived her corrections, her guidance, her subtle psychological pressure. He had begun to internalize her lessons. But ultimate test, the words hung in the air like a threat, though Riley said them without aggression. He nodded slowly, muscles tensing. "I'm ready," he said, though the lie was almost transparent even to him. Riley's eyes narrowed slightly, evaluating, measuring. "Ready isn't enough. You will be challenged physically, mentally, and emotionally. One mistake could end everything. Not your life, but your chance to truly understand. Are you willing to risk that?" Luke's throat went dry. He wanted to answer with bravado, with confidence, with the ego that had led him to test her weeks earlier. But he swallowed the words. Instead, he nodded again, tighter this time, his chest rising with the effort. "Good," Riley said. Her stance shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly. "We begin with awareness. Eyes closed, step forward." Luke's body froze. The instructions were the same as before, but the stakes were different. Now he understood that each movement, each decision could make or break him. He obeyed, closing his eyes, breathing deeply and trusting, for the first time, that Riley's guidance could carry him through. The yard seemed to fade. Dust, sunlight, and heat merged into a single sensory field. Luke felt the shift in Riley's stance before he even sensed her presence. A subtle movement of her boot, the brush of air against his arm, the faint whisper of her breath, all signals that he had to react instinctively. He lunged. Riley didn't need to strike. She simply redirected, guiding his momentum, and Luke hit the mat with a force that reverberated through his body. Pain flashed, but he processed it differently now, as information, not punishment. Again, she instructed, calm and deliberate. "Anticipate, feel the rhythm, predict, survive." Luke rose, muscles trembling, but his focus had sharpened. He no longer fought for ego. He fought to understand, to internalize, to survive. Each takedown, each shift of weight, each precise correction from Riley was a lesson etched into his muscles, nerves, and mind. The recruits and instructors watched, silent and tense. This was no ordinary training session. This was a crucible, a test of endurance, mental acuity, and emotional resilience. Even Mercer's normally unreadable face betrayed a flicker of admiration. Then Riley intensified the exercise. She added layers, distractions, subtle misdirections, psychological pressure. Sounds from outside the yard, shouting, moving vehicles, even the faint whine of helicopters in the distance, were amplified in Luke's perception, forcing him to process chaos while maintaining precision. Luke stumbled once, misjudged a movement, and felt her hand guide him with firm but non-threatening force. Her eyes locked onto his, piercing, unyielding, as she whispered, "Every misstep is a lesson. Remember what you've learned, control your fear, anticipate the unexpected." Luke's pulse raced, muscles screaming, lungs burning, but he forced himself to focus. He had begun to internalize the rhythm, the flow, the balance between mind and body. He reacted not just to what he could see, but to what he felt: the subtle shifts in air, the imperceptible movements in her stance. Sweat dripped into his eyes. Dust coated his skin. His uniform clung to him, heavy with effort and exhaustion, but he moved with a precision he didn't know he possessed. Riley's voice cut through the haze. "This is the final stage. Eyes open, full engagement. You will execute everything you've learned under pressure, under observation, and under judgment. One failure isn't just physical, it's mental, it's emotional. It's the difference between understanding survival and being unprepared for reality." Luke opened his eyes. The world snapped back into focus. Riley was moving, slow, controlled, deliberate. Each movement tested his reflexes, his anticipation, his endurance. He ducked, shifted, lunged, and countered, drawing on every lesson she had taught him. For the first time, he felt a fleeting spark of confidence. Not arrogance, not ego. Confidence built on skill, awareness, and survival instinct. But Riley wasn't finished. She increased the pace, forcing Luke into a rapid series of movements, takedowns, reversals, defensive maneuvers, all under the silent scrutiny of Mercer and the yard. Each motion demanded focus, precision, and split-second decision-making. Fatigue pressed against him like a physical weight. Luke's muscles screamed, lungs burned, and sweat poured down his face. He wanted to give up, to collapse, to escape the intensity of the trial. But the look in Riley's eyes, the calm command that had guided him from the beginning, anchored him. "Push past it," she whispered. "Pain is temporary, awareness is eternal, survival is everything." Hours seemed to compress into minutes. Every strike, every movement, every instinct was tested to its limit. Luke stumbled, corrected himself, adapted, and gradually, imperceptibly, he began to flow. His movements became smoother, his awareness sharper, his responses instinctive. The yard, watching in tense silence, felt the transformation. This wasn't just a trainee performing, it was a student learning to survive under extreme conditions. Finally, Riley stepped back, arms folded, eyes locking onto him. Luke's chest heaved, sweat dripping, body trembling. He had endured the ultimate test. He hadn't excelled perfectly, but he had survived mentally, physically, emotionally. Mercer's expression softened slightly. "Good work, Harrelson," he said quietly, his voice carrying authority and acknowledgement. "You've survived a test that few would, but remember, this isn't the end. Survival is a constant challenge, and Riley Knox, well, you've just glimpsed the standard." Luke's legs threatened to give out, but he remained standing, trembling with exhaustion and revelation. He realized now that Riley's lessons were more than physical training. They were life lessons. They were survival principles distilled into motion, instruction, and presence. Riley Knox's calm exterior finally softened just slightly as she nodded at him. "You've made it this far," she said quietly, "but remember, survival isn't a moment. It's every choice you make, every breath you take, every step you execute. Never forget what you've learned here." Luke, barely able to speak, nodded. Words failed him. Respect, awe, and a profound sense of humility filled the space where ego once resided. The yard exhaled collectively. Recruits, instructors, even Commander Mercer seemed to recognize the significance of what had just transpired. Luke had endured a crucible designed to push him beyond fear, beyond fatigue, beyond ego, and he had survived. And in that moment, he understood something crucial. This was only the beginning. Riley Knox, the Navy SEAL who had survived missions that most couldn't imagine, had revealed not just her skill, but her philosophy, her discipline, and her standard for survival. Luke had glimpsed it. He had felt it, and he would carry it with him forever. The ultimate test had ended, but its lessons, its challenges, and its echoes would resonate far beyond the PT yard, shaping Luke in ways he could barely begin to comprehend. The PT yard was quiet now, the intensity of the morning's training session giving way to a charged stillness. Sweat glistened on the uniforms of recruits, dust clung to their boots, and even the distant hum of helicopters overhead seemed muted, respectful of what had just transpired. Luke Harrelson's chest rose and fell rapidly. His muscles trembled from exhaustion and every fiber of his body ached, but none of that mattered anymore. He had survived Riley Knox's ultimate test, physically, mentally, and emotionally. And yet, as he stood there, breathing heavily and wiping sweat from his brow, he sensed that the day's lessons weren't over. Riley stepped forward, the black trident tattoo on her shoulder glinting under the sunlight. Her calm exterior had softened, revealing something more human, something personal. Her eyes scanned the yard and then locked onto Luke. "You've done well," she said quietly. Her voice carried authority, but also a hint of something deeper, perhaps pride, perhaps acknowledgement of the struggle he had endured. "Not many make it through what you just did. Not many even understand what it means to survive beyond the physical test." Luke tried to speak, to respond, but his voice faltered. Words felt inadequate, too small to encompass the storm of emotions coursing through him: fear, respect, awe, and a profound humility that had replaced the arrogance of earlier weeks. Riley continued, her tone shifting slightly, almost intimate. "The reason I put you through this isn't just to test skill. It's to teach awareness, to teach resilience, to show you that survival, real survival, isn't about ego. It's about understanding your environment, your opponent, and most importantly, yourself." Luke's mind flashed back to the first moment he had kicked her, the humiliating stumble that had preceded every lesson since. How naive he had been, how dangerous his arrogance could have been. And yet, that mistake had led him here, to this moment of clarity. Commander Mercer stepped forward, his boots striking the asphalt with measured authority. He had been silent, observing, but now he spoke, his voice low but carrying weight. "Harrelson," he said, "today you've witnessed something extraordinary, not just skill, not just discipline, but the embodiment of survival. Knox isn't here to break you, she's here to teach you what no book, drill, or simulation ever could. And you've learned it, whether you realize it yet or not." Luke's chest tightened. He understood now that this wasn't merely about combat training. It was about life, endurance, and the responsibility that came with power. Every decision mattered, every movement mattered, every instinct mattered. Riley stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "There's something else you need to understand, Harrelson. The missions I've survived, the choices I've made, they weren't just about me. They were about protecting others, ensuring that others could survive. Every lesson I've taught you, every correction, every adjustment, it carries that same principle. Survival is not self-serving. It's about responsibility, awareness, and control." Luke nodded, finally finding his voice. I understand," he said, though he knew the understanding was only partial. There were layers to her experience, to her lessons, that he might never fully grasp, but the truth of her words resonated deep in his chest. Riley's gaze swept across the yard, acknowledging the silent observers. "And that," she said, her voice carrying across the still air, "is why you respect the lessons of those who have walked the line between life and death. Not because of rank, not because of titles, but because of experience, endurance, and the will to survive and protect others." Luke's eyes lingered on the tattoo, the symbol that had first revealed her extraordinary background. Now he saw it differently, not as a badge of pride, but as a mark of responsibility, of survival earned in fire, blood, and unyielding discipline. Mercer's gaze softened as he addressed the recruits. "Today you've witnessed the legacy of a true SEAL, not just skill, but resilience, courage, and leadership. Remember this. Internalize it. Survival isn't about victory on a mat. It's about surviving in the world, in the missions, in life itself." Luke felt a shift inside him. The lessons, the training, the intense pressure of Riley's guidance, it had transformed him. He had begun as an arrogant, impulsive recruit, eager to prove himself. Now he understood the weight of true skill, the responsibility it demanded, and the courage required to survive both physically and emotionally. Riley stepped back, her expression unreadable for a moment, and then a faint smile touched her lips. "You've done well, Harrelson, but remember this, the real test isn't over when the mat is cleared or the mission ends. It continues every day in every choice, in every action. Carry these lessons forward, respect them, and never forget that survival comes first always." Luke's chest heaved, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and awe. He understood, finally, that the day's trials weren't about winning, proving himself, or even mastering technique. They were about transformation, about reshaping perception, internalizing discipline, and respecting the hard-earned experience of those who had survived what most could never imagine. The yard remained quiet, as if holding its breath. The recruits, instructors, and even Commander Mercer seemed to feel the weight of the moment, a living demonstration of legacy, survival, and the harsh truths of life under extreme conditions. Riley glanced at Luke one last time. "I can't teach you everything," she said softly. "Some lessons you have to experience for yourself, but what I can do, what I have done, is give you the foundation. The rest is up to you." Luke's mind reeled. Experience, responsibility, survival. He realized that every misstep, every mistake, every lesson he had endured under Riley's guidance had been designed to shape him into someone who could survive not just on the mat, but in the world beyond it. He nodded, understanding that the path ahead would be challenging, filled with unexpected trials and demanding endurance of body and mind. And yet, for the first time, he felt ready. Not fully prepared, but ready to respect the lessons he had been given and to carry them forward with humility, awareness, and resilience. Commander Mercer stepped forward once more, placing a hand on Luke's shoulder. "Remember this moment," he said quietly. "Remember the lessons, the discipline, the skill, and remember the standard that Riley Knox sets, not just as a SEAL, but as a survivor, a protector, and a guide. You've witnessed it firsthand. Carry it with you always." Luke's vision blurred with sweat and emotion. He felt a profound sense of respect for Riley, for Mercer, and for the lessons that transcended the physical. This was more than training. This was a legacy, a standard of endurance, skill, and survival that few could ever hope to achieve, and even fewer could comprehend fully. Riley stepped back, her stance relaxed, the faintest exhale of relief escaping her lips. She looked at Luke, eyes steady and commanding, and said simply, "Good work, Harrelson. You've survived your ultimate test. Now go live with it." Luke nodded, feeling the weight of the words settle deep in his chest. The ultimate test had ended, but its impact would resonate forever. He had been transformed, humbled, and enlightened. He had seen what it truly meant to survive, to endure, and to respect the lessons of those who had walked the edge between life and death. The PT yard began to stir again, recruits whispering, instructors exchanging looks, and the distant sounds of base activity returning to the air. But Luke remained rooted in the moment, understanding that what he had experienced would shape him far beyond the physical lessons he had learned. Riley Knox had revealed her legacy, shared her standard, and imparted the most profound lesson of all. True strength is measured not by victory or dominance, but by survival, awareness, and the courage to endure what most cannot imagine. And as Luke Harrelson walked away from the mat, chest still heaving, muscles still trembling, he knew he would never forget this day. Not just because of the physical challenges, not just because of the humiliation and triumph, but because he had glimpsed the extraordinary life and legacy of a Navy SEAL, a survivor, and had begun to internalize what it truly meant to live and endure in a world that demanded both courage and respect. The yard had returned to normal, but for Luke, nothing would ever be the same again.